Week 5, Lesson 3, Crime Comics. Back in the early 1930s, Dick Tracy made his appearance. It showed the police taking down violent and greedy gangsters, but it was always from Dick Tracy's point of view. Some caped heroes like Daredevil or Will Eisner's The Spirit would show one story from the crook's point of view, but then would always return to the hero's point of view and continue the series from the hero's view. By the early 1940s, it became clear that people were interested in more than just superheroes. And, to some keen-eye observers, it became clear that the villains were a lot more interesting than the heroes. Whereas most heroes were fairly bland and one- or two-dimensional, the villains could be complex, unpredictable, and ruthless. Add to this the fact that tales of true crime in the newspapers have been recorded and published in books and pamphlets since the mid-1800s, and you have a pretty strong foundation to build this idea on. This was how crime comics came about, using the comic book medium to showcase the stories about fictional and real-life crimes, usually telling the criminal side of the story. What is widely considered to be the first crime comic was Crime Does Not Pay, from Les Gleason Publications, by Bob Wood and Charles Bureau. That's right, the same guys from the same publisher that gave us Daredevil. Remember I briefly mentioned the Silver Streak, the book that Daredevil later got a spin-off from? Well, after 21 issues, the Silver Streak changed its title to Crime Does Not Pay in June 1942. Let's take a quick look at the cover. On the top, in front of a background of red in giant letters, is the word crime. Beneath it, in tiny, almost apologetic letters, are the words, does not pay. It's clear just from the title that crime is the major selling point of this comic. On the left, we see photos of real-life criminals. On the bottom of the page, we see an extreme close-up of a hand getting stabbed with a knife, as, in the background of the bar, a woman is being used as a human shield during a gunfight. And a tiny pink box at the bottom of the cover is telling you to be a detective. This cover is so much more intense than anything we've seen so far in this course. It's not just violent, it's unapologetically violent. There were no superpowered or costumed heroes here. These were bloody stories about realistic crimes that could or had happened in the real world. It would show gangsters getting into shootouts. It would show men getting stabbed. It would show greed or hate being the driving force behind all of these occurrences. The comics had a confessional or regretful tone, though, where, after all the murder and stealing, the criminals would never get away, and they would either be killed or caught and brought to justice. This was probably done so that Bob Wood and Charles Bureau could protect themselves from criticism. If parents or authorities complained about the book, then the creators would just say that they were trying to teach a moral lesson and that the pictures of blood and murder would just prevent children from breaking the law. This was partially successful. Parents were still complaining, but the comics were allowed to continue being made. As early as the third issue, Crime Comics got a mascot who would narrate stories for the years, giving them some context and puns. Mr. Crime was an omnipotent narrator who would never directly be included in the stories. There were some interesting ideas here. There were moral tales about married people hating each other and dying ironic deaths. There were brutal retellings of real-life crimes. There were historical crimes being retold in comic form. There were mysteries that the readers had to solve themselves, and the panels with the answers were upside down. So you had to turn over the comic book issue to see if you guessed who committed the crimes with all the clues that were given to you. Some of the stories were designed to shock readers with how brutal and violent the people in them would act. But, by today's standards, these are nothing that would stand out in modern television. The Crime Scene Investigation series have much more brutal and shocking things than anything you'll find in these comics. Still, in order to show that these comics were teaching lessons to children and adults, a letter form was opened, where readers would write in and tell the world how they'd been kept out of a life of crime thanks to reading these comics. Let's take a look at two letters from Crime Does Not Pay, issue number 74. It's been 5 months since I've left reform school. During this time, I've been a constant reader of Crime Does Not Pay, and your magazine has certainly influenced my life. I now intend to return to high school and go on to college instead of leading a life of crime. Signed, SS. I have read all your magazines, and I have learned from each one that crime does not pay. When I buy comics, I always look for the famous names Lev Gleason, Charles Bureau, and Bob Wood. They're swell. From Dolores Shamey, Dearborn, Michigan. Now, these sound cheesy, and you might wonder why people would write in thinking about how they would commit a crime, but write about how they changed their minds. It turned out that for every letter published, the writers of that letter would receive $2, which would come to over $28.50 in today's currency. They downplayed that part of the letters for the critics, though. Crime Does Not Pay sold modestly well during the war, but afterwards it became a significant hit. In 1943, it was selling about 323,000 copies per issue. But by 1948, it was selling over 1 million copies per issue. And, like any other success in comics, it had imitators. In 1947, there was True Crime Comics by Jack Cole. Also in 1947, there was the Headline Comics by Joe Simon and Jack Kirby. It switched over from a superhero comic to a crime comic when Simon and Kirby drew the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. In 1948, Fox Feature Syndicate made a comic, Crimes by Woman, which showcased usually beautiful women breaking the law. A newer publisher, EC Comics, started publishing 2 crime series, Crime Suspense Stories and Shock Suspense Stories, which started to promote more vengeance-driven stories that had twist endings. Comics were definitely getting more violent with the rise of the crime genre, which did cause some concerns. Those led up to censorship issues, which we'll be talking about later this week. In fact, in 1949, Canada was so concerned about the negative impact that crime comics would have on youth in the country that it banned the sale of them. Dave Fulton, Member of Parliament for Kamloops, passed what is now known as the Fulton Bill, under Part 5 of the Canadian Criminal Code, covering sexual offences, public morals, and disorderly conduct. Selling Canadian crime comics is still illegal in Canada today. However, Canadian citizens tend to be more reasonable than their members of Parliament, and this bill has never been enforced. But one of the biggest blows against the legacy of crime comics came from one of the men that's credited with starting the genre. Bob Wood would be declared a criminal himself. Like today, most of the work in the comic book industry was work for hire, so if the comics were making insane sales, the publisher saw most of the profits, not the writers or artists. When censorship kicked in, crime comics were forced to lose their edge, and the series was finally cancelled in 1955. From 1956 to 1958, Wood's main source of income was drawing softcore porn, usually with a violent twist or depiction of drugs. Wood became an alcoholic. In August 13, 1958, Jack Cole, the artist who drew Plastic Man and True Crime, was apparently Bob Wood's friend, committed suicide. After the censorship issues in comics made Jack Cole leave the industry, he got a job working at Playboy, doing cartoons for their magazines. The reason for Cole's suicide remains a mystery to this day. 3 days later, on August 16, 1958, Bob Wood started what would become an 11-day bender of alcoholic indulgence. It ended when Wood killed his girlfriend in a hotel room. On August 27th, he confessed his story to a cabbie and said he drowned himself in a river later that day, after he took a nap. The cabbie called the police and found the dead woman and a bunch of alcohol bottles around his hotel room. It turned out he had beaten her to death with an electric iron. He was arrested, and news of the broke comic book artist hit the front page. As you might have guessed, this did not help the industry. He pleaded guilty and was charged with first-degree manslaughter. It turned out the judge thought that the alcohol did most of the work in the killing. After only serving 3 years in prison, he was let out, only to have his corpse found at the side of a freeway. Turned out that Bob Wood had owed some loans that he couldn't pay to men in prison, and they intended to collect. You think that out of all the people in the comic book industry, Bob Wood would have been the one to know that crime does not pay. So, why are crime comics important to this course? They were one of the biggest alternatives for male readers to superheroes in comics. Crime comics brought some significant criticisms to the comic book industry. Crime comics were clearly targeting an older audience and succeeding in their marketing. Crime comics were one of two genres that grew in popularity in the late 1940s and 1950s, which caught the attention of the censors. Questions to contemplate. Are crime comics appropriate for children ages 8 and under to read? Why or why not? Can you think of any recent examples of entertainment portraying the criminal side of the story being successful?